So when watching the Borderlands 4 first look trailer, one of the first things you'll probably realize is they are going for a much more mature, darker tone. In fact, there's not a lot of comedy at all within the entirety of the trailer. And since that trailer has been released, we've actually gotten more information on this from a handful of different developers, and this seems to be the case, that Borderlands 4 is purposefully going into a more mature, more dark and sinister direction and going away from what we had in Borderlands 3, where it felt like a lot of the game was just forced in kind of toilet humor. Now, the first thing I want to look at is going to set the tone for this video and Borderlands 4 as a game, and this is from Sam Winkler, who is the narrative director on Borderlands 4, and after the trailer was released, he tweeted some information about the game. And the first thing he said is, Borderlands 4 is our most ambitious game yet. In service of that, I'm happy to say that I've gotten to work with some of the funniest people I know as contract writers. Now, this was just the first thing he tweeted. Obviously, Borderlands is still going to have comedy in it, even if it's going in a more mature direction. But then as people started asking him more about it, he started to give some additional information. And one of the first things he replied to was just asking about the darker tone of the game, because obviously from watching the trailer, it does feel like it's going to be a bit more mature, a bit more of a darker tone. And he said he's not at liberty to talk much about the content of Borderlands 4, but he remains firm in his criticism of Borderlands 3 overabundance of toilet humor. And this is one of the biggest criticisms of Borderlands 3. It felt like a majority of the game was just forced in toilet humor. There wasn't much at all super serious about the game, and the general writing and story is the biggest issues with Borderlands 3 in general. But then he also replied to another tweet kind of making fun of Borderlands 3's humor, and he said, I'm not going to say there's no toilets, but if the word skibbity ships in the game under my watch, I'm going to cry real tears. Paul Tassi joked that we were going to have a gun called Hawk 2A, and a fellow dev asked me if it was real, and I wanted to put my hands down the sink grinder. So this is just kind of setting the tone that the narrative director for Borderlands 4, which is a very important position for the general direction that the game is going to go in, is saying that he wants to tone back the humor a lot and doesn't want all of this toilet humor and all these kind of cheap memes thrown into the game. There's obviously still going to be comedy, as his first tweet would let on, but it's not going to be a similar style of comedy as Borderlands 3. And as we get into some of the other information we have, you'll start to see that this game is going to be more mature, more dark, and the comedy is probably going to follow suit. And the other information we have comes from an interview a Japanese site called Famitsu did with Randy Pitchford and Anthony Nicholson, Randy Pitchford being the president of Gearbox and Anthony Nicholson being the senior project producer on Borderlands 4. And some of the answers they give around the general tone and theming of Borderlands 4 is very interesting. So first off, they ask about the character at the end of the trailer, which we did later get to learn that he was called the Timekeeper even before this interview, but Randy Pitchford answers that he's called the Timekeeper, a name that will make sense to any hardcore Borderlands fanatic who's immersed in the series lore. And they go on to say, once we know that it's the Timekeeper, I think everyone will check out all of the references in previous games. He hasn't appeared in Borderlands until now, but he's been mentioned. Imagine a more sinister presence than the Emperor in the Star Wars world. That's the Timekeeper. He comes to the scenario with a creepy, sinister plan. And just that alone kind of sets a tone for who the main villain is going to be in Borderlands 4. The main villain in Borderlands 3, the Calypso twins, were very much not well liked. They didn't seem super serious most of the time, but the Timekeeper is seeming to be a much more serious and sinister character. And then Anthony chimes in and says, as you can see in the trailer, he's a dictator who rules from above. In the trailer, he literally looks down on everything from a high place and crushes the mass, signaling the clash of the two forces. As Randy said, he's a very dangerous man, and he's a big threat to the Vault Hunters in this game. And also keep in mind, he's going through all this information, we have had it confirmed that this isn't a previous character. This isn't like Handsome Jack in a mask or Roland, which some people thought it would be. This is a completely new character. As they've already mentioned, this character has been mentioned not specifically by name, but has been talked about in previous Borderlands games, but he's never been in any previous Borderlands games, and he's not some character we've already met. And then the interviewers asked specifically about the Calypso twins and just how generally annoying they were in Borderlands 3, and Randy answered, "I think you'll notice a clear difference in tone this time around. The Timekeeper is serious and sinister, and he's not messing around or playing around. He has a plan that's been brewing for ages, and the Vault Hunters are annoying distractions that he can't stand." A pretty big departure from Borderlands 3. This is a character that already has had this plan for a long time, and us as a Vault Hunters aren't seen to him as his biggest rival or biggest obstacle. We're kind of just an annoyance that stands in his way while he's trying to accomplish his overarching plans. He's something else. He operates on a different level than Handsome Jack's localized concerns or the Calypso twins' personal desire for power and attention. He has a gravitas that we haven't seen in Borderlands villains before. And Anthony adds that just to add a little something, he's a very calculating and very particular about how he goes about things and what he wants with this story. So there is a very clear distinction between the Timekeeper and all of the previous Borderlands villains. The Timekeeper is legitimately being made to be the most sinister and probably the most powerful villain we've ever gone against. And I do like how they're talking about that Handsome Jack had more localized issues or concerns when he was the main villain. He didn't have this super overarching plan about maybe other planets or other things like that. It was more localized, but the Timekeeper's plan seems to be much more encompassing, and he has much bigger plans than, let's say, the local things happening on this planet or on the moon. It seems that his plans are just a lot more involved than the previous villains in the franchise. And when we add up all of this information, I think Borderlands 4 has a pretty good chance, if they nail all of this, to just be a lot better than Borderlands 3. Borderlands 3 obviously had really good combat, but generally the story, the tone, the overabundance of toilet humor were very heavily criticized. And I think going into Borderlands 4, we're obviously going to have really good combat that's even improved. I went over that in my previous video. We're getting double jumps and sliding and grappling to massively improve the combat of the game. But now with all of this information, the game is going to have a lot darker, more mature tone than Borderlands 3 and potentially more than any other Borderlands game. While there's still going to be humor in the game, it seems like it's not going to be near as much toilet humor. It seems like it'll probably be a bit more mature humor. They're seeming to not want to just add in a bunch of real world memes into it, or at least not near as much as Borderlands 3. And they're trying to go for a bit of a darker tone. Then you get into the Timekeeper that's supposed to be a much more serious, sinister character that is probably going to loom over the story of Borderlands 4 in a much more serious way. And I would not be surprised if we don't defeat the Timekeeper in the base game of Borderlands 4. I would not be surprised if we go through a bunch of DLC and updates and we still haven't defeated the Timekeeper, because he's just that overarching of a main villain. And I hope the developers keep doing interviews up until the launch of the game, because a lot of the information we've gotten from these first Borderlands 4 interviews has made me much more excited about the game. They're saying a lot of the things that I want for the future of Borderlands as a whole. But that's all I want to go over, so thanks for watching.